Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu for the Nintendo Entertainment System is a game made up of diverse influences. While the most obvious one, Chan himself, is certainly at the forefront, there are several other aspects to the game which, at first glance, weren't really associated with Chan's career to that point, or may have even conflicted with what he was known for. Does Jackie pull off the stunt work of weaving through this combination unscathed, or is he destined for a black eye? This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining, and maybe even playing despite themselves. Right out of the gate, Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu is an odd release for the NES. And I mean specifically the North American NES, at least in 1990 when the game came out. It makes sense that a Jackie Chan game would be released for the Famicom, and even the European NES. Chan was a huge star in Asia and Europe throughout the 80s and into the 90s. In North America, however, Chan was relatively unknown at the time, outside of import VHS tapes and a cult martial arts movie following. In the game's review in the December 1990 issue of GamePro, the reviewer, do I really have to use the pseudonym? Ugh, fine. Abby Normal even goes out of her way to point out that Chan was going to be unfamiliar to the majority of people playing the game. It wouldn't be until 1995 that Chan would become a household name in North America when New Line Cinema brought Rumble in the Bronx to North American theaters. Which is actually kind of funny considering North American NES owners had access to a Jackie Chan game pretty much from the console's initial release in 1985. It's not really a secret anymore that Kung Fu, the black box launch game from IREM, is actually based on the weirdly titled 1984 movie Wheels on Meals, or Spartan X as both the movie and game were known in Japan. In other words, Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu was not the first Jackie Chan game North American NES players were able to play, but it was the first to properly feature Chan himself, even if players didn't entirely know who he was. Personally, I came across this game after seeing Rumble in the Bronx. This was another one of those games I wound up getting in the mid-90s with the 3 for $10 deal from my local video store. You know, the one mentioned in both the Vice Project Doom and Dick Tracy videos. Going into the game, after having seen Rumble, did make me appreciate it more, even if I did find it a little confusing. But we'll get to that. Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu was published by Hudson, but developed by Now Production. This wasn't their only collaboration from the time, as Hudson would have Now Production, or Now Pro as they abbreviate it, work on Adventure Island 2, 3, and 4 for the NES. Well, Famicom in the case of 4. Now Pro was also responsible for the majority of the Splatterhouse games for Namco, developing Splatterhouse 2 and 3 for the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive and Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti for the Famicom. I mention these games specifically because playing through Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu, you can see their influence on the gameplay mechanics. The game, as is the case with many licensed NES games, is a straightforward side-scrolling action game. Which makes sense, action is in the title after all. More than that though, you get melee combat that feels an awful lot like Wanpaku Graffiti, complete with some suspect collision detection. Seriously, not once could I get a steady flow going with the bonus round where Jackie has to hit training dummies, and items that appear in the air and forced scrolling sections which are more than a little reminiscent of the Adventure Island games. Even the art style falls in line with those games as well. Jackie appears here in a chibi form similar to Wanpaku Graffiti's version of Rick, and even bears a passing resemblance to Adventure Island's Master Higgins, or Master Takahashi since he is based on a real person after all. That's not necessarily a bad thing though. Both Wanpaku Graffiti and the Adventure Island games share a lightheartedness that works with the action comedy style that Chan's career had comfortably settled into by that point. It works that they went with a chibi Jackie Chan rather than a more realistic sprite, both because of that aforementioned lightheartedness, and because it allows Chan's personality to come through in a way that a sprite along the lines of, say, Bill or Lance from Contra, or even his sprite in Kung Fu, would be unable to convey. His facial expression changes when he throws a punch or launches into a jump kick. He winces when he gets hit. He leaps in the air, hair standing up, a pained expression on his face, and grabbing his bottom when he lands on spikes or lava. He falls to the ground twitching with a boggled expression when he loses a life. Perhaps most charming of all, if you leave the game over screen where he is left literally holding the bag, its weight will eventually overcome him and squish him before returning to the title screen. Even the basic transition between standing and walking shows off Chan's personality. He is determined when walking or fighting, but when he stops for a moment, a smile comes back to his face. The gameplay also helps make playing as Jackie feel like playing as Jackie. There are small touches like the fact that Chan will slide on the ground a bit if you do a jump kick, but keep pressing forward, almost but not quite executing a sweep kick. The special moves are where the Kung Fu part of the title really comes through though. The player doesn't have access to them all the time, but that's because they're treated like power-ups. The player finds them hidden in frogs throughout the levels, and they can take out most enemies in a single hit, and do significant damage to bosses. Basically, all the player has to do is press up and B, and Jackie does something cool, whether it's a roundhouse kick, a vertical jump kick, or a mid-air somersault. Sure, it's not Street Fighter or even something like ER Kung Fu or Karate Champ, but it is a fun time, and emulates the seemingly effortless way Chan pulls off his moves in his films. Speaking of his films, that's where the game feels off. So, Jackie comes across as Jackie, even if the caricature on the title screen is, let's be nice and call it less than spectacular. The game feels decent even if some of the hit detection isn't the greatest. So, what's the problem? Well, it's the overall aesthetic and drive of the game. As mentioned earlier, Chan had settled into an action comedy style by the point of this game's release, and that definitely comes through in his character sprite. The rest of the game, though, it feels more like a wuxia film, something Chan wasn't really associated with at the time, and wouldn't be until 2008's Forbidden Kingdom. And even then, it is a heavily westernized approach to the genre. For those unfamiliar, wuxia is a Chinese fiction genre combining fantasy with history and martial arts action. It tends to be more lyrical and, in film terms, is characterized by elaborate fight scenes involving wirework, mystical settings, and historical conflicts. Western audiences would likely be most familiar with the genre by way of Ang Lee's 2000 film Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Lee's film hews closely to the wuxia format, but more recent examples which may be familiar to Western audiences can be found in Marvel's take on the genre in Shang-Chi, or, believe it or not, the Kung Fu Panda series from DreamWorks. No, I'm not kidding, and oh hey, Jackie Chan is in that as well! Anyway, here we have Chan fighting bandits, mystical creatures, elemental demons, giant cloud monsters, tigers, literal dragons, snowball-throwing yeti, statues of Buddha, no really, that's what the manual calls it, warrior monks, frog monsters, and more across such locations as an underground lava pit, ice caverns, a raging river, leaping across clouds in the sky, hills of skulls? There's more of that Wanpaku graffiti influence, I guess. And mountains. There are even bonus games which seem to adhere to the wuxia style as well. More leaping across clouds, punching leaping fish while in a river, training against combat dummies, although that last one at least feels like it does belong in a Jackie Chan game. The rest of this aesthetic, however, feels out of place, both because Chan was not known for wuxia movies, and moreover because he did not do the wire work associated with them. Chan is famous for doing his own stunts, and having movies that, if not more grounded, I'm looking at you, the tuxedo, are less fantasy-focused. What really confused me when I played the game, though, is that it feels kinda like it's trying to be a Dragon Ball game. The wuxia aesthetic suddenly makes sense if that's the case, because Dragon Ball was based on Journey to the West, even if it was very loosely. Jackie's martial arts master in the game looks suspiciously like Master Roshi. Roshi's flying turtle shell even appears in the third stage of the game. Well, okay, I'm not sure if that's Roshi's flying turtle shell or a Gamera reference, but still. Then there's the fact that the player has access to a move that can easily be taken for a Kamehameha. Jackie and the player have access to a charged ranged attack the manual calls a Psycho Wave. Fun fact, the manual doesn't actually tell you how to use the Psycho Waves. It tells you how to get them back after using them, but not how to actually use them. It's not a good game manual. These Psycho Waves take out most enemies with one hit, and are particularly useful against the final boss's final form. It really does feel like the devs wanted to make a Jackie Chan Dragon Ball game. I can't prove it though, because I couldn't find any info on who actually worked on the game. Pseudonyms were prolific in this era of game development, and they were definitely used heavily in the credits at the end of this game. On top of that, it's also clear that this wasn't a case of the game being changed in its migration from Japan to North America, like with what happened to Dragon Ball Shenron no Nazo. That game shifted from a Dragon Ball game to the weirdly generic Dragon Power when it was released in North America in 1988. Here though, the game started out as a Jackie Chan game on the Famicom and remained one on the NES, just with much more toned down box art. At this point, we should also talk about the game's story, and tied to that, the main villain. Normally, there'd be a spoiler alert, but the game really doesn't do much in the way of storytelling. There's an opening cutscene which, if you hadn't read the manual, wouldn't make much sense outside of the standard villain kidnaps damsel in distress and Jackie must save her trope. If you had read the manual, you would know that the damsel is Jackie's twin sister, Josephine, which... Jackie had a fair number of half-siblings, but not one named Josephine. At least not one that we know of anyway. Jackie and Josephine are apparently an unbeatable kung fu team when together, so the sorcerer, no really, that's the only name they give him, kidnaps Josephine in order to split the duo up and make them beatable. Okay, can we just take a second to appreciate what's going on here? Sure, the kidnapped damsel trope is being used, but she's not helpless and she's not being kidnapped as a hostage. She's being taken because she and her brother Jackie are so badass together that the only way to bring them down is to separate them. On top of that, she's not a love interest. She's a sibling, which is something else I can appreciate. Well, until we get to the TurboGrafx 16 port of the game, that is. Despite also being developed by NowPro, just like the NES version, there were significant changes made to the TG16 version of the game. Voice samples were added for Jackie, the levels were significantly altered and lengthened, and Josephine went from being Jackie's sister to being his girlfriend. They didn't even change her name. She is definitely Josephine in both games. That's awkward, kinda creepy, and kinda predicts an awkward, creepy porn genre popular nowadays. Great, thanks for that. To be fair though, it's not as though Josephine got to actually, well, do anything in the NES game. The manual talks about how she and Jackie are unstoppable when they use their kung fu together, but when Jackie and the player actually rescue her from the sorcerer's human form, she just replenishes Jackie's health before the final boss battle. That's it. No actual kung fu, no teaming up to fight the final boss, no taking control of Josephine so she can strike back against the sorcerer who imprisoned her, just a health top-up. It's not even a full health top-up either. Let's go back and talk about that sorcerer and final boss for a moment though, because I do actually like what they did here. So, after pushing through a gauntlet of dragons, Jackie finally reaches the sorcerer who is kind of a pushover if we're being honest. As long as Jackie and the player use Jackie's jump kicks, the sorcerer can be taken down with minimal to no damage. I like that approach for two reasons. One, it suggests that Jackie, in the course of his journey, has mastered his kung fu enough that even an otherworldly sorcerer is not a serious challenge. And two, the sorcerer, once defeated, takes on a final form, that of a giant evil spider. While the sorcerer's human form is fairly easy, this spider is ridiculously difficult. And that's not entirely because the spider is a challenging boss. See, for this battle, Jackie jumps on Goku's flying cloud, yeah, I'm not even gonna pretend that's not Dragon Ball inspired at this point, and fights the spider while they're both flying in midair. The problem here is that Jackie and the player can move anywhere on the screen with the D-pad. Why is this a problem? Because if the player wants to use Jackie's limited kung fu moves on the spider, it's incredibly awkward. Remember, the player needs to press up and B. Normally, that's fine. When Jackie is on normal footing, pressing up doesn't do anything. Here though, pressing up will move Jackie up, which means that it's entirely possible to not only miss the spider with your kung fu attack, but also to inadvertently move yourself into the path of the spider's attack and take damage yourself at the same time. I was able to beat the spider using my accumulated psycho waves, but it took a number of tries to be able to do so. Speaking of, there's one last thing to mention here, partially because it is an odd approach to presenting a game. If the player looks in the back of the manual itself offers a code for 99 lives. Why was this included in the manual itself? If they were going to do this, why not just give the player the 99 lives from the outset? Or offer infinite continues like Ninja Gaiden or Castlevania? There is a problem with this code though, and it's the same problem the manual has with the Psycho Waves. It doesn't properly tell you how to input it. Nintendo Power published more detailed instructions for the code in its September 1991 issue in the classified information section. That Nintendo Power had to do that when the code is just straight up printed in the manual itself says everything you need to know. It is not a good game manual. Jackie Chan's action kung fu offers a fun and accurate representation of the movie star in the title role, even if it doesn't really reflect the types of movies that star was known for. It offers an interesting, if slightly inconsistent, mix of platforming and action gameplay set against a backdrop that is equal parts wuxia and Dragon Ball, which makes it quirky even for a Jackie Chan experience. There's more than enough charm on offer here that it will put a smile on your face, which makes it a good weekend rental.
One more